Hello, welcome listeners and market participants to KBRA's European Credit Podcast, Conversations in European Credit. I'm Gordon Kerr, Head of European Research at KBRA, and today I am joined by Karim Nassif from our Project Finance team here at KBRA.
Thanks for having me on again, Gordon.
Today we will be covering the topic of a recent report on Irish wind farms, titled Offshore Wind, Opportunities and Challenges to Irish Development. The report can be found on kbra.com along with our other reports on project finance and sustainable finance. Further, you can find our comments on corporate topics such as those related to the oil and gas sector, including a piece on the geopolitical risks, which do remain elevated. Now, let's dig into the topic at hand. Offshore wind energy has been a prominent feature of the Danish, UK, and other European markets for several years. But now an opportunity has arisen to transform Ireland's energy markets. However, the path, as always, is not that straightforward as first appears. There are significant obstacles that lie ahead, including political, regulatory, and commercial challenges. In this episode, Karim and I will look into these opportunities in further detail and the associated challenges. Ireland's ambitious renewable energy targets could transform into a realistic proposition over the coming years. Okay, let's start with how this interesting report was instigated. What has taken Ireland so long to get going on this, Karim?
Well, Ireland has taken a bit longer than others to get on with moving the offshore wind proposition, especially given the availability of it. And this is not because of any shortage of wind. The plans that they've laid out, we think, will put the country firmly on the map in terms of offshore energy wind supplies, along with other neighboring countries such as the UK.
Yes, they have set out some ambitious plans and could become energy independent. Currently, Ireland does have wind turbines, but to date, these have all been onshore. Offshore wind energy currently accounts for a small portion of the European electricity mix, about 2%. However, cumulative capacity represented by about 34 gigawatts at year-end 2023, when including Europe and UK offshore wind, according to a publication, Wind Europe, which is up from 22 gigawatts in 2019. So the market across Europe is growing. All of this growth in Ireland and across Europe is part of both energy security concerns as well as building upon already in place sustainability plans, which have perhaps been accelerated to some extent by recent energy issues caused by the elimination of Russian supply. Building on the European offshore renewable energy strategy from 2020, Europe aims to install more than 100 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030 as part of new plans running up to 2050.
Yes, Gordon. All this growth is supported by key EU targets. For example, the carbon neutrality by 2050, the Fit for 55 package. The publication of last year's EU Industrial Green Plan, which we covered in a recent publication, is aimed at enhancing Europe's net zero industry and complementing the REPowerEU plans. Now, the EU is targeting 42.5% of gross energy consumption coming from renewable sources by 2030. And that really forms the centerpiece of the RED III directives. Crucially, member states, including Ireland, must transpose RED III into national law by May 2025. However, certain provisions, including those aimed at accelerating permit granting procedures, must be transferred into national law by the 1st of July 2024. So for Ireland, it's going to be important to understand how these directives will be acted upon in the context of domestic policies and procedures relating to obtaining permits and granting of licenses and awards and contracts.
Yes, in addition to those you mentioned, the European Commission published its Wind Power Action Plan towards the end of 2023, with 15 immediate actions to support the sector. Further, 26 governments signed the European Wind Charter, promising to implement the policies laid out in the EU plan. The wind power package included measures to accelerate permitting and improve auction design.
Yes, now this year is going to be a pivotal year in terms of auctions. After a pretty disappointing amount of new projects being awarded in 2023, now, this was largely attributed to a failure in auction design and the context of spiraling costs as well as supply chain interruptions. So as much as 50 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity is going to be up for auction this year in Europe. The roadmap spans established markets around the North Sea, such as the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark, as well as the new frontier markets, of which Ireland is one, but also includes other countries like Norway and Finland.
Okay, so let's dig into Ireland then. What is Ireland doing in this context?
So, Ireland's new offshore wind targets are ambitious, and they do include 5 gigawatts of grid connected offshore wind, in addition to 2 gigawatts of non grid connected floating offshore wind by 2030. So, just a few more years. Now, the country aims to deliver 20 gigawatts of offshore energy by 2040, rising to 37 gigawatts by 2050, which is approximately 6 times the country's current nameplate capacity.
Okay, so how do they plan to get to these targets?
So they're going to split these into phase 1 and phase 2 projects. It's anticipated that a large proportion of the 2030 targets will actually be achieved through the phase 1 project, which includes Ireland's first ever offshore wind auction. However, with a combined capacity of phase 1 projects totaling around 4.4 gigawatts, coupled with the prospects that some of the phase 1 projects may fail to secure a route to market or development consent, more offshore projects might be needed to meet the targets for the end of this decade. This transition from phase 1 to the longer-term offshore regime is referred to as phase 2.
Okay, so in Ireland in May 2023, a significant milestone on the journey to deliver offshore wind capacity targets was achieved when the country successfully held its first offshore wind auction. What happened and what sort of capacity was included in that auction?
So the auction, which was launched by EirGrid, allowed for the conclusion of the phase 1 projects. 4 projects with a combined capacity of 3 gigawatts were awarded. The winning bids were the North Irish Sea Array, Dublin Array, Codling Wind Park, and Skirdy Rocks. The winning bids will be granted a 20-year CFD with the average price of the winning bids at €86 per megawatt hour, one of the lowest prices paid by an emerging offshore wind market in the world. Now, 3 wind farms will be built off the east coast and 1 off the west coast. We think, or we understand from the market, that the projects could be operational by 2028, depending on how fast they attain planning permission. Attention is now shifted to phase 2 for Ireland to meet its 2030 targets.
Okay, so what else do they need to take into consideration in order to progress this?
So, as per the phase 2 projects, they will be required to plug the gap in delivering the 5 gigawatts of offshore plus the 2 gigawatts of floating that we mentioned earlier as part of the 2030 targets. Now, to this end, in Q1 2024, the government published a document entitling Powering Prosperity, and this includes the medium and long-term strategy for delivering offshore wind in Ireland. The strategy highlights things like the supply chain capacity, opportunities for offshore wind, measures to mitigate the risk to achievement of Ireland's offshore wind targets, measures to develop both indigenous and export demand for offshore wind. An integrated spatial and economic framework for the development of clusters of economic activity, such as DMAPs, are going to be critical to the development of the offshore wind sector in Ireland. This plan also complements Ireland's Accelerating Ireland Offshore Energy Programme, as well as the broader National Energy and Climate Plan for 2030. What will be important for Ireland also are the benefits and the opportunities that's going to come from delivering on the plan. So that will include, for example, capitalizing on the fact that Ireland, just like other Northern European countries, has plentiful wind and access to acreage. It also includes the fact that the cost of offshore wind has decreased dramatically in the past decade, from about €200 per megawatt hour to 60 megawatt hour. It's also been proven, offshore wind has been proven to have a more robust energy value with a more stable generation profile throughout the year compared to mature technologies such as solar. What's also important for Ireland is that the execution of this strategy will allow the country to reduce its reliance on energy imports from markets such as the UK, which is a big provider of gas.
Okay, given the opportunity and Ireland's plans, what are the challenges that they face to achieving these targets?
So there's a few that we've outlined in the report and would narrow them down to getting the auctions right. Okay, that's probably high up there on the agenda. As we mentioned earlier, 2023 was a disappointment. And that was because of the failure in the design of the auction system. The auction system set the CFD strike prices too low relative to the costs faced by the industry. Flexibility to allow a portion of revenues to be deployed under PPAs or predicated on merchant cash flows is also something wind developers have been asking that can improve appetite on tenders. Ireland's first offshore wind auction last year suggests higher project costs are starting to be factored in. The second one is the development cost risk. While the levelized cost of energy has come down since the first offshore wind projects a couple of decades ago, the last 2 years did experience a spike in costs of approximately 40% relative to the start of 2022. This reflects higher raw material costs, steel, copper, higher interest rates, general input cost inflation, and structurally higher commodity prices. The third challenge is permit delays. Now, these can lead to a significant interval between the date an auction is awarded, FID, and the actual commencement of construction. This intervening period can be associated with significant changes in market conditions. Now, the Irish government's multi-phase spatial planning processes through the phase 1, phase 2, and eventually there'll be also a phase 3 involving floating offshore solutions, are designed to centralize the process. For Ireland, however, the challenge to meeting the energy transition targets will be to ensure that the priorities and objectives of multiple stakeholders, including the Department of Energy and Climate Change, EirGrid, MARA, the new maritime regulator, the Commission for Regulated Utilities, and Board Planola, environmentally focused non-governmental organizations, and the general public remain aligned and focused. Some other considerations also in terms of challenges are infrastructure development and procurement constraints. Now, an entire ecosystem needs to be developed to facilitate the offshore wind industry. For example, the transmission system operators will need to ensure sufficient grid capacity is made available. This has also been a source of delays in project execution in Europe in the past. And finally, competition for limited resources. Now, Ireland is not operating in a vacuum. There are a number of other markets also competing for the same sponsors, for the same resources. Now, given the scale of the EU's renewable plan, several markets will be competing along with Ireland, and Ireland will need to demonstrate that it has the right framework, it has the right commercial opportunities, and it has the right infrastructure to encourage sponsors to choose Ireland.
And I suppose there is still one more and more to our world, and the reason we've been looking at it in this report is the financing risks. So there are still remain challenges associated with financing these projects.
Indeed, nothing's going to happen unless a lot of these projects become bankable, because the government on its own is unlikely to want to shoulder all of the costs associated with this opportunity. Offshore wind projects are characterized by having significant construction risks at the outset, as well as operational and potentially market risk in operation, and are typically funded on a project finance basis. Lenders are going to need to be comfortable with the EPC contracts, make sure that the construction overrun and delay risks are appropriately passed on to contractors, and that the projects have secured sufficient supply chain elements, including vessels and equipment. On the operational side, lenders will want to know that a viable route to market has been established and that there are commercial contractual arrangements allowing for a predictable cash flow stream over the term of the financing. If there's market risk, lenders will want to understand the power market dynamics in the country and whether sufficient reserves have been put in place to mitigate against periods of downside, particularly in terms of power prices. Technical considerations will also be relevant. We note an increase in the size of the turbines in recent years. To what extent might projects become obsolete based on design? This has not been a major credit concern to date. Also, if less mature technologies are being considered, such as floating offshore wind, financiers will want to know that technology and operational risk is appropriately measured. Ultimately, if financed on a project basis, lenders will need to ensure that projects can deliver a healthy debt service coverage ratio over the period of the debt tenor.
Recent years have demonstrated that the wind sector, like many others, is not immune to the impact of conflict or black swan events, such as the global pandemic or the war in Ukraine. Developers who locked in fixed price auction bids based on best estimates can find those figures outdated and insufficient some years later, and are therefore exposed to the brunt of cost increases or limited to their profitability.
Yes, the pandemic did trigger a degree of pain across the industry, but it's also shed light on the need for governments and regulators to introduce flexibility in commercial arrangements to account for volatility and input costs. Despite this, capital markets, including both public and private debt, have been willing to accept construction risk for large infrastructure projects. We saw this back in Qatar with the Ras Laffan project. Commercial arrangements such as CFDs have typically been used to support offshore wind project financings and are generally backed by strongly rated government entities. Therefore, they are typically very popular with project financiers and investors. Further, getting institutional investors comfortable with construction risk on such large projects has required the same type of mitigants that bank project finance lenders use, such as sufficiently robust EPC contracts that pass through overrun and delay risk, sufficient committed sources of funds at the outset to meet uses, adequate liquidity to meet unexpected changes in business and financial conditions. This asset class is suitable for the capital markets if appropriate mitigation measures are in place.
Well, thank you very much, Karim. That has been a very interesting discussion and brings up a number of topics that I think investors will find interest in learning more about. Thank you very much, as always, Karim.
Thank you, Gordon.
As we heard, offshore wind has the potential to transform Ireland's energy markets, and important progress has been made. This is supported by EU policy and offers Ireland an opportunity to be energy independent in the future, a big goal for a country in today's climate. While this opportunity exists, there remain important obstacles ahead. How Ireland navigates some of these challenges will determine how the ambition transforms into a realistic proposition over the next several decades. As Karim and I have outlined, there are challenges, and key to them is financing. Commercial structures need to be awarded at a level that ensures the projects can raise funding in the private finance market. Attracting sponsors through competitive pricing and profitability will help Ireland compete with more mature markets such as Germany, the UK, or the Netherlands. The country's target is ambitious, but the potential rewards are significant. That's it from us today. As always, we hope these conversations in credit help to illuminate the many trends taking shape across the markets. For more in-depth coverage of the themes discussed today, or to learn more about our unique approach to credit, sign up to the KBRA website to read all our research. Have a topic idea or comment you'd like to share? Reach out to me or Karim on today's episode. Be sure to rate, share, like, and subscribe to this podcast so you can be notified when new content is available. Invite your colleagues as well. We'd love to count you all as informed listeners. This is Gordon Kerr, thanking you for being part of the conversation. Take care, everyone.